There is a strange moment, quiet, fleeting, but deeply revealing, that occurs when you catch your mind in the act of thinking. A thought arises, perhaps mid-sentence in your own inner monologue, and in that instant, something deeper stirs. A recognition, not just of the thought itself, but of the listener, the silent witness behind the noise, behind the process. It is here, in this liminal space between cognition and awareness, that the mystery begins to unfold. What if thinking, as we know it, is not the original voice of our being? What if thought is not the speaker, but rather the echo? The phrase, "when you're thinking, you're actually listening," seems, at first glance, to play with contradiction. After all, thinking is considered the engine of the self, our internal narrator, our tool for control, our fortress of identity. But to entertain the idea that thought is more receptive than generative is to shake the very foundation upon which we build our sense of autonomy. It calls us to explore a deeper truth, that perhaps the thoughts we believe we produce are not born within us, but received by us. And what, then, is the source? This question is not merely philosophical, it is intimate. It is the question behind every question, whispered beneath the stream of consciousness itself. It casts our internal dialogue not as authorship, but as reception, not as invention, but as translation. To listen while thinking is to become aware of the strange architecture of inner space, a chamber, not of walls, but of mirrors, reflecting signals that are not wholly ours. To live inside this question is to be drawn toward an ancient silence, the kind spoken of in mystery schools and inscribed in sacred geometry. The silence behind the syllables, the breath before the word. This is no ordinary silence, for it is not the absence of sound, but the presence of something prior to thought itself. It is the unstruck bell, the infinite canvas upon which every mental gesture is painted. And we, you, me, all of us are not the painters, but the ones interpreting the brushstrokes as they appear, after they've landed. This awareness changes the game. No longer are we merely creators of thought, masters of logic, or captains of cognition. We become, instead, receivers. Tuning forks, vibrating with frequencies beyond our understanding. Decoding waves that pass through the corridors of our neural temples. When you are thinking, you are listening to what, or whom? Is the next mystery. Are you hearing echoes from the collective unconscious, ancestral whispers buried deep in your DNA, electromagnetic pulses that intersect with the mind like a radio receiver? Or perhaps, something even stranger, the self, beyond the self, a soul, trying to be heard through the static of the everyday mind. And herein lies the deeper paradox. We often confuse the signal with the noise. We mistake the loudest thoughts for the truest ones, the most persistent for the most authentic. But the true listener knows better. The true listener begins to discern the difference between the voice of conditioned memory and the whisper of wisdom, between the shouting of the world and the quiet nudging of something more eternal. The ancients spoke in veiled tongues of this listening. The Vedic rishis sat in stillness, not merely to quiet the mind, but to become instruments of reception. Hermetic sages taught that the mind is not the origin of wisdom, but the lens through which it is refracted. The Sufis danced in spirals not to create ecstasy, but to surrender to a higher frequencies, so that thought would become music, and the self would dissolve into the listening. In all traditions, hidden beneath dogma and ritual, is this single, golden thread, that thinking is never solitary, that to think is to commune, and that the source of our thoughts may lie beyond our personal history, beyond even the reach of our individual minds. In the modern age, saturated with information and the ceaseless buzz of mental computation, this idea seems foreign, even disorienting. We have trained ourselves to solve, to strategize, to categorize. We treat the mind as a processor and ourselves as programmers, yet we rarely question where the code originates. But what if the code was never ours? What if thinking is more like tuning into a broadcast, one that can be distorted, misinterpreted, or even hijacked? This exploration isn't merely spiritual or philosophical, it is practical in the most radical sense. For if you are always listening while you think, then it matters immensely what you are tuned to. If thought is an act of reception, then discernment becomes the highest cognitive virtue. Not speed, not cleverness, not volume, but the subtle art of knowing which signals to amplify, and which to let pass like clouds through an open sky. In this way, your thoughts are not random, they are patterned, resonant, responsive. They are the echoes of your inner alignment, shaped by what you attend to, what you believe, what you are willing to hear. And this makes you powerful, not because you control your thoughts, but because you choose your resonance. You choose which station you listen to. You choose, moment by moment, whether to hear the voice of fear, or the voice of presence, the clang of old programming, or the chime of insight. And so, when you're thinking, you're actually listening, not to silence, but to signals, not to yourself, but to that which moves through you. It is a shift from authorship to awareness, from identification to observation. It is the doorway through which thought becomes sacred and listening becomes an act of creation. To understand the layered mystery within when you're thinking, you're actually listening, we must first dismantle the prevailing mythos surrounding thought. In the architecture of modern consciousness, thought is king. It is equated with intelligence, productivity, agency, the very hallmark of being human. But thought, for all its apparent mastery, is a deeply reactive phenomenon. It arises after something else. It is shaped not only by prior experience and emotion, but by unseen structures that predate our sense of self. This shift from viewing thought as creation to perceiving it as reception is not just a philosophical turn, it's a portal. A recalibration of the inner ear toward what lies beneath the surface, static, at its core. This idea reveals that the mind is more of a mirror than a monologue. What appears to be spontaneous mental activity is often the reverb of countless impressions, social conditioning, ancestral memory, collective belief systems, and even archetypal energies that swirl through what Carl Jung once called the collective unconscious. To think, in this context, is to be tuned, and the one who thinks is not the broadcaster, but the receiver. Echoing the signals of a vast invisible ecology, one might imagine the human mind not as a fortress of individuality, but as a node in a web, vast, luminous, and interconnected, like a single point of light on a multidimensional grid. Each thought is the result of myriad unseen currents, converging for a moment into coherence. What we call my thinking is often just the imprint of something larger, speaking through the lens of personal form. And that form, the personality, the ego, the story of who we think we are, filters and colors what is received. This is the first veil. To see beyond it, we begin to trace the source. If thoughts are signals, then what is the signal tower? Where does the mind pick up these broadcasts from? The answer is not singular. Sometimes it is memory, looping endlessly in cycles of unfinished stories. Sometimes it is fear, painting futures that haven't happened with the brush of past trauma. Sometimes it is love, true, undiluted presence, speaking not in words, but in sudden clarity, in goosebumps, in an inner yes that has no rational explanation. And sometimes it is none of these. Sometimes, when the veil is thin, it is something else entirely. Call it the soul, the higher self, the field, or source. But it speaks with a different accent, subtle, spacious, non-linear. It does not rush, it does not panic, it does not judge. It speaks in symbols, synchronicities, and sudden insight. And when we are quiet enough to really listen to our thinking, we can begin to discern its tone. This discernment is not learned in schools. It is cultivated in stillness. In the in-between moments where thought softens and we feel more than we analyze here, we begin to notice that not all thoughts are equal. Some feel heavy, like chains. Others feel light, like wings. Some close the heart, others expand it. These qualities tell us something crucial: that thought is not neutral. It carries energy, vibration, intention, and behind that intention is its source. Thus, the core idea emerges with crystalline clarity. Thought is not the originator of truth, but the interpreter of energy. The mind, in this framework, is an instrument, a stringed one, perhaps in response to whatever it is tuned toward. When you're thinking, you're actually listening to the result of this resonance. You're hearing the harmonics of your internal state and external influences woven together into a pattern that feels like you, but is often anything but. The implications are vast. Every belief we hold, every judgment we form, every assumption we accept is part of a larger resonance field. And yet, most of us mistake the echo for the original voice. We believe our thoughts to be entirely our own, unaware that we may simply be carrying the frequency of cultural programming, inherited trauma, or collective fear. The mind, in its default state, is more sponge than sword. But herein lies the opportunity. If we are always listening while thinking, then we can choose what we listen to. We can begin to orient ourselves toward a deeper signal, not the loud, reactive noise of ego or media or expectation, but the quieter, steadier whisper that speaks from alignment. This whisper is rarely urgent, but it is persistent. It emerges in dreams, in gut feelings, in the magnetic pull towards certain people, places, or paths. It's the feeling of truth before it becomes language. This distinction between surface, thought, and underlying signal births a powerful clarity. Not all thoughts are guidance. Not all thinking is wisdom. And not every idea that appears in the mind is worth believing. Some are distortions, some are parasites. Some are attempts to defend a story that no longer serves. The real work, the sacred work, is to listen through the noise, past the mental clutter, into the hum beneath the hum. This is where true thinking begins, not in invention, but in reception of the right frequency. This listening-based model of cognition reshapes the way we view intellect, education, even identity itself. It dethrones the ego from its imagined control panel and replaces it with something far more fluid: awareness. Not the awareness of objects or outcomes, but awareness as a state of being. When awareness becomes the center, thinking becomes a tool rather than a tyrant. It serves rather than controls. It reflects rather than projects. It listens, and in listening, it becomes attuned to truth. So the next time a thought arises, one charged with urgency or self-judgment, pause. Listen not just to the thought, but to the place it's coming from. Feel its frequency. Notice whether it tightens or loosens your being, whether it isolates or connects, whether it echoes fear or emanates peace. This is the art of mental listening. It is not passive. It is deeply active, engaged, discerning. It is the evolution of thought from noise into signal, from reaction into revelation. In this sacred reversal, thinking is no longer the act of grasping for answers, but the process of opening to what is already known in some deeper place. We stop trying to dominate thought, and instead begin to hear it truly. The mind becomes less of a hammer and more of a tuning fork. And in its resonance, we rediscover what it means to be not just thinkers, but conscious receivers. Long before words were etched onto stone, and before language carried thought across space and time, there were stories, vessels for truth, too vast to be compressed into logic alone. Within these stories, cloaked in symbolism and metaphor, the inner mysteries of consciousness were encoded. They survive still, like echoes in mythic chambers, waiting for the listening mind to decode their message. And it is here, in the realm of symbolic narrative, that the deeper meaning of when you're thinking, you're actually listening, reveals itself most profoundly. Imagine, if you will, a temple not made by hands, but by awareness itself. A hall of mirrors stretches infinitely in all directions, each mirror reflecting not just your image, but your thoughts, memories, dreams, fears, and hopes. You walk through this temple as if in a dream. With every step, a mirror lights up, displaying a thought as if it were your own. But over time, you notice something strange. The mirrors were lit before you stepped in front of them. The thoughts arose before your conscious decision. The images were not conjured by you, they were already there, waiting. This temple is your mind. The mirrors are your thoughts. And the light that animates them is your attention. In this symbolic realm, we begin to understand, you do not create every thought. You illuminate them by listening. And some of these mirrors are clean and clear, reflecting a truth that aligns with the deeper self. Others are fogged by years of conditioning, trauma, inherited belief. Still others are distorted funhouse mirrors, creating grotesque caricatures of reality that seem real only because they feel familiar. This hall of mirrors is not a prison, but a test, a place of alchemy. It invites you to recognize the difference between reflection and source. When you realize that not every mirror shows your true face, you gain the power to choose which mirrors to honor and which to walk past. You become a conscious listener, not a passive reflector. This discernment is liberation. The moment you stop believing every thought as yours is the moment you step outside the illusion of mental ownership and begin to listen with presence. Let us turn now to another story, one carried from the banks of ancient rivers where mystery schools once whispered of higher sight. It is said that deep within every human heart lives a feather-on ethereal instrument given by the gods. This feather is not for writing, but for weighing. In Egyptian myth, it was the feather of Mat, placed upon the scales in the hall of judgment to weigh the soul against the truth. But this symbol extends beyond death. It lives in each moment we choose to think or feel or act. When you are thinking, you are weighing your soul against invisible currents. Every thought either brings you closer to the feather's weightless grace, or further into heaviness. Some thoughts rise from the heart like a sacred windlight, intuitive, true. Others fall like stones, born of fear or false identity. And so, to think is to listen, not just to the voice of the mind, but to the hidden scales of your own resonance. You become the priest in your own temple, discerning the weight of each whisper within. Still deeper into the dream of metaphor, imagine now a vast ocean of light. You, as an individual, are a vessel floating on its surface. The light from this ocean contains all potential thoughts, all possibilities, all frequencies of consciousness. But your vessel, its shape, its sail, its tuning determines which waves you catch. Some will lift you toward inspiration, others will churn you in confusion. When you're thinking, you're catching one of these waves. You're not speaking. First, you're receiving. In the ancient Vedic worldview, the seers did not call themselves creators of knowledge, but rishiyas, literally hearers. They believed that the great truths of existence were heard in the inner ether, like a frequency, decoded by consciousness. This was not metaphor to them, it was experiential truth. The mind, properly still, becomes like the surface of a calm lake, and the eternal wisdom reflects upon it. But when the waters are stirred by constant noise, distortion reigns, and yet, the impulse to still the mind was not to eliminate thought, but to hear its source more clearly. These stories, taken together, form a sacred triangulation. The mirror, the feather, the ocean, reflection, resonance, reception. They converge on a single point of awareness that you are not the source of your thoughts. You are the listener of their origin. The real you, the self behind the thinking, is like a monk sitting in the back of the temple, while the chants echo through the chambers. Sometimes the chants are divine. Sometimes they are discordant. But the monk does not mistake them for himself. He listens, discerns, and lets them pass. The danger lies in forgetting this truth, in mistaking every mental chant for an instruction, in letting the funhouse mirror define your shape, in forgetting that the ocean speaks in many voices, and not all of them are your own. This is the veil the mystics speak of. The Maya, the illusion. It is not the world that is illusion, but the thoughts we believe without question. Thoughts become real when we grant them our faith, our identity, our name. But thought without awareness is like a boat without an anchor, drift in currents it does not understand. But awareness, steady and listening, becomes the lighthouse. It watches the passing ships of thought and signals home only to those that carry truth. And truth, in this inner terrain, is not a static idea, but a frequency, a tone, a sensation of alignment that transcends logic. When you listen while thinking, you are not grasping for content. You are feeling for tone. You are sensing which thoughts resonate with the deep hum of your soul's knowing. This is the symbolic key. Thinking is not an act of the mind alone. It is the echo of listening in motion. The real power lies not in controlling what appears, but in choosing what to hear. The monk in the temple. the sailor on the light sea, the heart with the feather. These are not merely images, they are blueprints of inner architecture. And so, when you next find yourself entangled in thought, ask not, "What am I thinking?" but rather, "What am I listening to?" For this is the pivot that transforms the mental realm from chaos to clarity, from noise to music, from mirror to window. It is the sacred shift from mind as a master to mind as a messenger, from thinker to hearer, from identity to essence. To step from the poetic into the practical is not a descent but a deepening. For any truth that cannot be lived in the trembling immediacy of daily life remains hollow beautiful, yes, but brittle. If, when you're thinking, you're actually listening is to be more than a conceptual cone, it must ripple through how you wake up in the morning, how you speak to a loved one, how you interpret silence in a room, and how you respond to the storm of thoughts that arises uninvited in your inner sky. This section, then, becomes a Bridger translation of symbolic insight into embodied action. Begin here, in the hum of your ordinary moments. Not in a temple or a meditation retreat, but at the kitchen sink, in traffic, on your third hour of work, or while standing quietly in a hallway. These are the places where the mind churns its most unconscious melodies. Most of us, conditioned by speed and distraction, react to thought automatically. A judgment arises and is mistaken for fact. A worry flickers and becomes a forecast. An internal voice criticizes, and we assume it is truth speaking. But what if, in that moment, you pause not to stop the thought, but to hear it differently? What if you practiced listening to your thoughts the way a musician listens to sound, noticing pitch, vibration, dissonance, texture? This shift is subtle but radical. You no longer try to wrestle the thought into silence or argue with it. Instead, you ask, what is the quality of this thought? What does it want from me? And who beneath is listening? This single act of listening changes the alchemy. Thought loses its hypnotic grip when it is observed with clarity. The power it had came not from its content, but from your automatic identification with it. But now, as a listener, you have space. You recognize that some thoughts are not messages to be obeyed, but simply echoes to be noticed and released. The inner monologue becomes less of a dictator and more of a guest, loud perhaps, but not in control. In practical terms, this cultivates a new relationship to mental noise. Say, for instance, you're preparing for an important conversation, and your mind begins spinning. What if I mess up? What if they judge me? What if I say the wrong thing? In the old paradigm, you might try to silence these thoughts, or, more likely, become entangled in them, feeding the anxiety with more thinking. But in the new paradigm, you pause and listen. You feel the tone of those thoughts. They are tight, contracted, future-obsessed, not rooted in the now, not grounded in presence. With practice, you begin to recognize such thoughts as old frequencies, not new data, but recycled programming. You hear them as you might hear a commercial playing. In another room, familiar, repetitive, and no longer persuasive. This discernment lets you return to yourself, to what is real in this moment. Perhaps your breath, perhaps your body, perhaps the still awareness underneath the mind's narration. And from this rooted place, the next right action arises, forced, but clear. This is not detachment in the cold sense, but deep engagement with truth. To listen in this way is not to reject thought, but to refine your inner ear. Over time, your life becomes a kind of music, and you are the conductor, no longer trying to play every instrument at once, but instead allowing harmony to arise through conscious tuning. Another implication blooms in the realm of relationships. So often, conflict between people is less about what is said, and more about the mental narratives that shape how we interpret what is said. We do not respond to people, we respond to our thoughts about people. If someone is late, the mind might whisper, "They don't respect me." And if we mistake that thought for truth, our response becomes defensive or cold. But if, in that moment, we listen to the thought and feel its tone, perhaps anxious, perhaps self-protective, we may realize it is not wisdom speaking, but old fear. This realization births compassion. You see that your thought was not you. but a voice inside you, trying to make sense of uncertainty. You hold space for it, but you do not follow it blindly. And because you are listening, truly listening, you are more able to listen to the other person, to not just their words, but the spaces between them. You begin to hear what lies beneath the surface of others' speech, just as you do with your own thoughts. Listening begets listening. Conscious thought begets conscious presence. The workplace, too, becomes a new field of practice. In environments driven by deadlines, analytics, and decision-making, the mind tends to become utilitarian, a tool for efficiency. And indeed, it must be. But even here, the principle of receptive thinking applies. Before making a decision, pause, not to delay, but to tune. Ask, is this a reactive thought or a responsive one? Is this urgency born of fear or clarity? Am I amplifying a frequency of lack or listening for alignment? The results may not always be immediate, but the shift in your state will be. And that state, the energy you bring to action, often determines the outcome more than the action itself. To think, as a listener, is to lead from alignment rather than adrenaline. It is the difference between calculated brilliance and intuitive genius, between a clever answer and a wise one. Perhaps the most life-changing integration, however, unfolds in solitude. When the world is quiet, the mind grows loud. Doubt, desire, grief, longing, these rise like specters from the depths. But now you are no longer afraid of the voices within. You know you are not alone with them. You are listening to them. And because you are listening, you are not possessed by them. You become like the mountain watching the storm pass over its peak, unmoved, yet aware. Eventually, even the storm respects the stillness. The thoughts come, but you are not grasping. You hear them and smile gently. You see how some are borrowed, how some are ancient, how some are simply fragments of collective noise. And in this recognition, a space opens up. From that space comes insight, creative spark, authentic direction, love, even, because the clearest signal, the one we call soul, higher self, or inner knowing, was always waiting beneath the static. Speaking in the tongue of silence, to live as a conscious listener, is to become both scientist and mystic. You observe the data of your thoughts, while sensing the deeper music beneath them. You navigate life, not by controlling every thought, but by attending to the quality of the signals you allow yourself to tune into. This is the true empowerment, frequency, moment by moment. And so we return back to the place we never truly left. The origin behind the origin, the listener behind the thinker, the presence behind the stream of thought that we have long mistaken for ourselves. In this final turning, we find not an ending, but a new orientation. The path of when you're thinking. You're actually listening is not a destination, but a remembering. An unraveling of false authorship, a soft but irrevocable revelation. That awareness is the true origin, and that thought is its instrument, not its master. There is a moment, perhaps, you've already known it. Or perhaps it waits for you in some still corner of the day when you hear a thought arise, and instead of grasping it, or fearing it, or running with it, you simply see it. You listen. Not like someone waiting to reply, but like someone watching a candle flicker in the dark. That moment is sacred. In it, you are not thinking, not in the usual sense. You are receiving. You are witnessing the architecture of your inner world in real time. From this place, the world changes not in its form, but in its feel. Life becomes less a maze of decisions, and more a dance of attunement. You no longer move just by calculation or compulsion, but by resonance. You feel when a path rings true, when a word aligns, when a silence says more than speech. You learn to trust the non-verbal pulse of reality. And your thoughts become collaborators rather than critics. Allies instead of adversaries. This shift is not something you must struggle for. It is already here. The only requirement is willingness. Willingness to slow the automatic reaction, to make space, to listen with the whole of your being. Not just to others, not just to music or nature or dreams, but to the stream of thought itself. To treat each arising idea like a ripple from a deeper ocean. To ask, from where does this come? Does it bind or free? Does it echo truth or fear? You learn to feel the shape of truth, not by logic alone, but by how it moves inside you. And this sensitivity is power, not dominance, but mastery. For now, you are no longer at the mercy of the mind. You see its games, its echoes, its loops, and you do not resist them. You do not fight your thinking. You listen to it consciously, and in doing so, you reclaim the space between stimulus and response, the space where freedom lives. You become a tuning instrument for the real dot in this space. Transformation happens not by force, but by fidelity, to silence, to presence, to truth. Your identity is no longer constructed from the loudest thoughts or the most persistent fears, but from the quiet certainty that you are the awareness in which those thoughts appear. This does not remove you from the world, it roots you in it. Deeper, fuller, clearer dot. And this clarity births compassion. For when you see that your thoughts are echoes, you begin to understand that everyone else is listening too often unconsciously. You hear in their anger the old recordings of their pain. You hear in their distraction the noise of their fear. And you meet it not with argument, but with presence. Because you've learned how to listen, you've seen how sacred it is, and now, you offer that sacredness to others, not by telling them what to think, but by being the space in which they, too, can begin to hear. This is your invitation, not to change your mind, but to relate to it differently. To meet each thought as a messenger, not a master, to discern its origin by feel. To allow it, listen to it, and then let it pass if it carries no resonance. To shift from internal noise to inner music, from fragmented chatter to harmonic reception. And to build your life not on the thoughts you fear, but on the truth that you hear when you listen from stillness. You are not the voice. You are the space in which the voice speaks. You are not the storm. You are the sky it moves through. You are not the thought. You are the listener. And so, the journey begins not with effort, but with noticing. In this very breath, notice what your mind is saying. Don't analyze, just hear. Then feel beneath it. Notice what remains when the thought dissolves. That space, that awareness, that is you. That is where wisdom waits. That is where peace is always humming. That is where all true thought begins. As listening, let that listening lead you. Let it shape how you meet yourself, how you love others, how you interpret the chaos of the world. Let your mind become not a battleground, but a sanctuary, a space for echoes to be heard, honored, and transformed. Because when you are truly listening, even to your thinking, you are already home.